It's a great pleasure to welcome you. My name is David Champion. I'm the chairman of the Anglo-Turkish Society. And we're here today, of course, to discuss this wonderful book, which is hot off the press, indeed brought to us from Istanbul by the venerable publisher.
Here he is.
Oh, yes, Sinan Kuneralp, who's going to, of course, say a few words anon, but it's very, very nice of you to come across.
Very nice of you to ask us to come.
Now, I myself didn't have the great privilege of knowing Zeki Kuneralp. I was just too young, really, just a generation below. But I've read much of these memoirs, and they really do bring back so much of the era, which, of course, I do remember. And it's marvellous to see his delicate and polite interventions in so many different parts of London diplomatic life. And as the series unfolds, I think it will be a priceless record of how people, or of how a very fine professional will go about his life in those days. And you will see in them that Cyprus seems to be absolutely dominant. And one of the obvious points is that it's still with us today. And somewhere in there's a record of one of the people that Zeki Kuneralp talks with, saying he thinks that the Cyprus affair will drag on for a bit longer yet. I can't remember who said that now. Was it one of the generals? Anyway, but I think it's certainly a very, very wise pronouncement. But what are we going to do tonight? We're going to start with, I think, with Sekirin Prendergast, who was the former British ambassador to Turkey and the former chairman of this society, who's kindly going to talk about his reflections in meeting with Zeki Bey himself. And then we're going to move on to Sinan, who will talk about the book, and then we'll move on to Selim Kuneralp, whom I should welcome, of course, as the former Turkish ambassador, among other places, to the European Union. And we look forward greatly to the comments that you may have, and thank you very much for being with us. So also we're very grateful to our online audience. What we'll do, I think, is we'll talk for about an hour here with our speakers, then we'll move to general discussion, and then we'll bring in our online audience, and we'll certainly finish by 8 o'clock at the latest, because we think 2 hours is enough for this kind of thing. So, thank you very much indeed, and the floor is yours.
Shall I stand up or what?
You must make that choice. How do you feel more comfortable when you speak?
I'd be better sitting down, because I'm a bit wobbly these days. And I wanted to say what a great honour it was to be asked to open the batting, as we say in this country still. I went to Istanbul, to Turkey in 1964, on the very bottom rung of the diplomatic service. I was a junior attaché, and I went to be a language student. And I don't know if the Foreign Office do a sort of general round telling everybody who's going and asking if they want to be briefed. But if so, I was a bit surprised to receive an invitation to come and have tea with the Turkish ambassador. And it must have been a rather slack day for Zeki Bey, because he gave me about an hour of his time, and he reflected on what it was like being a relatively young Turkish diplomat. And there was one difference between what he told me and what's in his memoirs, because sorry, this is a memoir, not the latest book. This is Just a Diplomat, the excellent memoir he made about his entire life. And he told me that one of his ambassadors, and I see from the memoir that it was the Turkish ambassador to Romania, was a famous orator. And he felt that he needed to say everything 3 times, because once and then again, in case they hadn't understood it the first time, and the third time for emphasis. And he followed the same practice in his telegrams, in his reporting telegrams back to Ankara. Now, in these days of WhatsApp and encipherment and crypto this and crypto that, we don't understand what it was like in the old days when you had what was called book cipher. And everything had to be done laboriously and manually. So Zeki Bey told me that they took a decision in the embassy, without the ambassador's knowledge, that they would prune his drafts to the necessary length, which is about 1/3 or less than 1/3 of the draft. And they gaily did that until the ambassador went back to Ankara on leave. And what they hadn't understood, he told me, was that the ambassador was very proud of his output and used to go to the Turkish Foreign Ministry and ask to see some of his recent telegrams. And he was outraged to find that not the magnificent drafts that he had produced, but vastly truncated versions, which nevertheless conveyed exactly the same point. Now, in the book, it says that his boss in the Chancery, in the political section, was prudent enough to know that this was likely to happen, and therefore they were forced to send rather long telegrams. Anyway, he talked to me for about an hour. We were served tea. He told me that he had British cousins, and I see a couple of them here tonight. Very welcome.
All of them, actually.
How many?
All of them.
All of them.
You're surrounded.
Okay, but he said he wondered whether they were aware that his aunt had married a German general. It was, I hasten to add, a First World War German general and not someone from the Waffen SS, which might have been a bit more embarrassing. And then when I went back as ambassador 30 years later, I found that Zeki Bey was still there, but that he was pretty well housebound in his flat overlooking the Sea of Marmara. So if I had a chance, I used to go and see him. And I found him in the wheelchair, suffering from what seemed to be a very slow developing form of multiple sclerosis, but absolutely still 100% mentally, very, very sharp, and very acerbic sometimes in his observations. For example, he told me that he thought that the Turks suffered from a collective inferiority complex about their language. When they knew that you were learning it or had learned it, they say, well, why on earth would anyone want to learn Turkish? I think that's changed a bit since then, but that was his view. He also had the view that Turkey had an Islamic foreign policy. I said, how so? He said, well, you know, it's supposed to be a secular state, it's supposed to be a secular foreign policy, but look, the Gagavuz in Moldova are Turks. They're really quite pure Turks. They speak a pure form of Turkish. We take no interest in them. We take a huge interest in the Chechens, and the Chechens have no linguistic or ethnic link with us. Therefore, I think that we have an Islamic foreign policy. And he was always very, very good value to go and see. And he had a lovely little flat overlooking overlooking the Sea of Marmara. And he had a picture of his wife, who had been murdered by Asala, the Armenian terrorist group, on the wall. And he used sometimes to say that she had the better part. So those are my recollections of Zeki Kuneralp, a great man, and I was delighted to read his memoirs and then to read these later. Oh, by the way, I just want to say a word about these notebooks. Like you, I noticed the emphasis on Cyprus at the beginning and on the move from Paris to Brussels of NATO towards the end of his time in London, his first time in London. And what struck me was the much greater role played by the permanent Under-Secretary in those days, who was Sir Harold Catcher. And he seemed to go in really, not every day, not every week, but very, very regularly. And if it wasn't Harold Catcher, it was Sammy Hood, who was Lord Hood, who was one of my old bosses, or Jack Rennie, who went on to be head of MI6. And he had very, very good access. And occasionally, he spoke to someone called Dodson, Derek Dodson, who ended up as ambassador in Turkey, if any of you remember a good few years ago. And even, well down the line, someone called Parsons, who was Richard Parsons, who was my first boss in the Foreign Office. But these days, I think the permanent Under-Secretary has a much more managerial role than being actively involved in policy. He also had exceptional access to ministers. Of course, it was because of Cyprus and because of these conferences in Geneva and so on. But he was seeing Ram Butler regularly, later Patrick Gordon Walker. He was also seeing Lord Carrington, who was a Minister of State at the time. And again, when I was in Ankara, one of the frustrations was that if we were pushing a big project, we wanted to get it for a British firm, and we thought that the Foreign Secretary might give it a push, we were usually told that, and we wanted him to ring Mrs. Chiller, or the Prime Minister to ring Mrs. Chiller, who was the Prime Minister at the time. We were told that, the Minister will be in his constituencies, but the Prime Minister might be able to catch him at between 10:15 and 10:30 on Saturday morning. Whereas the French were making calls from Chirac to Mrs. Chiller to charm her really quite regularly. So things have changed from then to now, and things will carry on changing. Thank you very much.
Before we turn to the next speaker, could I just ask you something? The level of bilateral conversations with other ambassadors and other representatives of ambassadors, is this quite normal? Because he doesn't seem to spend much time in meetings.
Well, the thing is, he wasn't there that long on his first trip.
Right.
And in those days, you had a practice, which I try to maintain, which is you make a first call on all of your ambassadorial colleagues, every single one. And then they make a return call on you.
Right.
And indeed, when I went to Turkey the first time, I was given a stack of calling cards, and you were to ask your ambassador would cover it with his own card, bent at the corner, with a PP pour présenter, and you handed that out to people to show that you were kind of kosher and that you had the backing of the ambassador. And when you left, you were supposed to distribute another card to your counterparts in the embassies with PPC, pour prendre congé, and that did not get the ambassadors covering things. So things have changed a lot. Plus, an invitation from the embassy was a royal command, and you had to be there. No matter what you were doing, you had to drop it. I mean, I'm talking about a social engagement like a dinner and so on. When we were in Cyprus, the High Commissioner was Peter Ramsbottom, the Honourable Peter Ramsbottom, and he rang up our flat one day because he was short of a woman for lunch and wanted to invite my wife, and he got through to our 3-year-old son on the phone, who said, I'm awfully sorry, but Mummy's having a poop. And again, I think you also turned up early for a cocktail party in case there were other guests who turned up early. And of course, you don't want to spend the entire evening shaking hands with one couple. You need to be able to move them on, and you need people there to receive them and move them on. And I found that didn't altogether imply by the time I got to Ankara. And instead of the whole ethos of the service had changed from everyone being there to look after the ambassador, who was the personal representative of the Queen, to you being there to look after the staff. And that's a psychological change. So things ain't what they used to be.
Thank you very much. That's very, very illuminating. Thank you. Well, now we pass on to the publisher, his son, Sinan Kuneralp.
Thank you very much for that charming account of my father's, of your meeting with my father. I'm sure that Selim and I were both very touched. We all know the famous quip about an ambassador being an honest man sent abroad to lie for his king or queen or president or country. And a few months after my father passed away, I was invited to Washington to a conference, and I met an official from the State Department, whom I suspect had at one point been the station master of the CIA in Ankara. I've never been sure, but he told me that Kuneralp had been the only Turkish diplomat who never lied to us, meaning the Americans. So would that mean that he was a bad diplomat or a good one? I don't know. But a few years before, when I was doing in my gap year, like most of my contemporaries, I hitchhiked from Morocco down to the Horn of Africa and the Yemen. And whenever I felt the need for a nice meal and a hot shower and a soft bed, I would knock at the door of an embassy, a Turkish embassy that is. And most of the ambassadors were colleagues of my father. And my father at that time was the Secretary General in Ankara, so the second man of the ministry. So they said, well, we better take care of the son of the boss. And in Cairo, the ambassador then complained that my father, that was in the mid-60s, and Turkey was inaugurating a policy of rapprochement with the Arab world and Islamic world. And the ambassador in Cairo had been in the forefront of that movement. And he complained that my father was sabotaging this rapprochement. I took note of somewhere, and I said, well, he probably knows something. And a few months later, I was in Addis Ababa. Again, I wanted a nice shower and a hot meal, and I knocked at the door of the embassy there. And the ambassador in Addis Ababa at that time was a pure secular Kemalist. And he said, you know, I love your father, I respect him, but I don't agree with his policy of rapprochement with the Islamic world and the Arabs. So I was puzzled, and when I returned to the family surroundings, I told my father that, and he was very happy. That shows that I am a very good diplomat. No one really knows what I think and what I do. So, the book that we will be talking about this afternoon is a strange volume. My father, when he started, when he first reached a position of responsibility in 1957, becoming the third man of the ministries, took the habit of writing down in notebooks a summary of most of the conversations we had either with his colleagues or with other officials. And he continued that habit till he retired in 1979. It is not a diary. It is not a memoir. So I don't know in which category of a word that is, a discipline that is very much fashionable nowadays, the ego document. What kind of ego document this particular series is, but it's not a diary insofar as he doesn't appear in it. We have absolutely no idea what he thinks, what his impressions are. It's a sort of a mirror image of something, but it's not very clear what it is. But it's an interesting. It's a sort of a source material for future historians of Turkish foreign policy in the middle of the Cold War period. What is interesting, and what we just heard from Sir Kieran, is he is not, because I've had his social engagement diaries, so I compared with what appears in his notebooks. He doesn't necessarily recall every single conversation he had. I'm sorry that your meeting with him in 1964 never got into his notebooks. I'm sure that you told him very interesting things, but it didn't. He didn't record it, which perhaps you would. So he came to London in 1964 after having served 3 years in Switzerland, and he came here just as the Cyprus, one of the many succeeding Cyprus crises erupted, and he was known in the Turkish foreign ministry as being Mr. Cyprus, because he had been part of the negotiations between that led to the independence of the island in 1960. So he had followed every single negotiation with the Greeks and the UK. So when the crisis in 63-64 erupted, he was summoned. He was sent to London as the tripartite conference was being prepared. So he took part in the meeting. That was his first. He served twice in London, first from 1964 to 1966, and then from 1969 to 1972. And as Sir Kieran said, and David, the main part of the volume here is devoted to the Cyprus crisis, which drags on nowadays. It has taken sort of different aspects and different forms, but the problem is still here with us, and we probably will have to live with it. And as for a foreign ambassador serving in London in those years, the highlight of his mission was meeting the Queen. Normally, you would meet the monarch twice during your mission. When first you come to present your credentials, and then at the end of your mission to bid farewell. So, throughout the mission, you would meet the royals at garden parties or at the beginning of the year. The royal family would greet the diplomatic body in corpore, in Buckingham Palace. So in January 1964, the entry I think it's on 29th of January, he meets the Queen with our mother, and the Queen complains about the difficulties of raising teenagers. Prince Charles, I'm 1 year older than Prince Charles exactly. He's born in November 1948. I was born in 1947. So my mother was very much understanding how to deal with teenagers. So it was a very apparently nothing serious was discussed. But on the other hand, when he left in June 1964,
66.
No, when he left.
He left 66.
In 66, sorry, what did I say? Well, he left in June 1966. He again is received by the Queen, and I was very much surprised, because I thought that the Queen never touches on any political matters in these meetings and encounters. But the Queen there complains not about her teenager son, but about Charles de Gaulle, his attitude against NATO, and his wishes to move the NATO headquarters from Paris to Brussels, and for about 20 minutes they exchanged. Well, I don't. She went on talking about that. So during his second mission, he's again received by the Queen, and the Queen says how it's very unusual that an ambassador is appointed twice to London. And my father says, yes, but we have a case in the the Ottoman diplomatic service of another ambassador who served twice in London during Your Majesty's great-grandmother's reign, Queen Victoria. So she was very happy with that continuity. And again, when he leaves in 72, the Queen this time complains about a few weeks before she received my father. The president of what was called in those days Federal Germany, President Heinemann, paid a state visit to the UK, and apparently he was very rude, showing that he was bored. And the Queen complained about this lack of good manners on the part of someone, the president of a state which is an ally of the UK, especially then a country that relied on the presence of the British Army on the Rhine. So she felt that he was completely out of bonds, to say that. So, but this, I don't know how Sir Kieran would probably know much more about that. But was it done that the Queen would touch on delicate political subjects like that with foreign diplomats?
I guess not. She could be very spiky. When we go to dinner afterwards, I'll tell you some of the things. I looked after her for 9 days in Zimbabwe, and she could say some very spiky things indeed.
I'm sure.
But she was also very experienced. And did your father see her by himself?
I think with my mother, and then the members of the embassy, as far as I know, Selim will confirm that, they were received at the end of the audience. The staff would sort of line up and present their respect to the Queen, but they were not present at the audience. But I didn't think that there were anyone from the royal household either.
Well, you know that the monarchy is supposed to be above politics.
Yes.
And what I would guess is that she assumed that the conversation she was having with your father was private and would not be publicised.
But she was wrong. She was obviously wrong. But another meeting with a member of the royal family was when with this during these garden parties or the beginning of the year reception. Again, all the foreign missions. I don't know if the habit still goes on, because in those days there were not more than 120 missions. Now I think there are probably close to 200, and asking every single mission with every member staff to Buckingham Palace would be pretty difficult. But the ambassadors would line up with according to the order of presidents, or alphabetically, presidents probably, or alphabetically. Anyway, and the ambassador would be at the head of the line, and the staff behind him. And Prince Philip came to Wellington, and probably too he had a set sentence to a set question to every head of ambassadors he went, and he asked my father, "Have you done anything else?" And my father said, no, I'm just a diplomat. And when he retired, he picked up this title, this answer, as a title for his memoirs, Sadece Diplomat, or just a diplomat. Those days were, for Turkey, the 60s were probably one of the most auspicious decades of modern Turkish history. The unfortunate military coup of 1960 by 1964 was a forgotten thing. Turkey had gone through 2 general elections, very fair, and we were on a sort of fair path of development and political stability. So being a Turkish ambassador those years was, if not a sinecure, it was not also the delicate job that the position has acquired in later years. When he was reassigned to London in 1969, the instructions he received, he had 3 main instructions. One, prepare the visit of the Queen, the state visit of the Queen, which was scheduled for 1971. Increase the sale of tobacco to the UK, and arrange for Turkish Airlines to land not at Gatwick but at Heathrow. So these were sort of very mundane instructions. And when one thinks that nowadays tobacco is not a main Turkish export, and that probably every single British household is the proud owner, as I'm quoting Boris, my nephew Boris, they have every single household in the UK is a proud owner of a Beko washing machine. So, and Turkish Airlines has 12 daily flights to London, and is probably one of the best airlines in the world. In 1969, it had a very poor record, and that's why the British transport authorities didn't want it to land at Heathrow, and they sort of channeled it to Gatwick, which was supposed to be a sort of secondary, and because there are not that many of us who remember the first days, the first years of the Turkish Airlines, but they were called not TDHY. They hate you.
We called it fly and die with THY.
So you can see the great improvement that Turkey has gone through in some fields since then. But there was a shadow in that rosy, in the 70s in Turkish history was a difficult decade. We had many cases of terrorism. In one case, 2 British technicians at the radar base on the Black Sea were killed by leftist guerrillas. That put the embassy in a difficult position, and even worse was this: he has completely disappeared from the headlines. A young British boy was used by his family as a mule and to carry drugs, and was caught by Turkish police and sentenced to Tamil Devi. He was sentenced to a long term of imprisonment. That evoked an outcry in the UK. The tabloid press had a field day, and it sort of put a shadow on my father's last months in London. So I suppose, but funnily enough, he confided to the Icelandic ambassador. He said, "Don't worry about the British press. During the Cod War, which opposed the UK to Iceland, I was the subject of incredible onslaught by the press. So you shouldn't pay any attention." I don't know if how much that comforted my father, but he was relieved, I suppose, in a way, though he was looking forward to a long period in the UK. He was nevertheless relieved to be moved to Spain, which was sort of prestigious position, but not professionally, not very important for Turkish in the Turkish diplomatic service. But he thought it was a nice place for a pre-retirement post. Though he had many friends in the UK, both in politics, university, journalism. He had a very close relationship, as great sympathy for Patrick Gordon Walker. You mentioned, Zeki mentioned him. Lord Carrington was probably a very good friend of him. Carrington, whenever Lord Carrington would come to Istanbul, he would come to Fenerbahce, to the flat, to the extent that after my father died, he lived with my mother died, and my father retired to Istanbul. He lived with his mother, who looked after him. She was in her 90s, and she was so much used to see every visiting British politicians or celebrities paying a visit to Fenerbahce. She was furious when Mrs. Thatcher came to Istanbul, to Turkey, and didn't come to Fenerbahce. This is about everything that I can say, and I'm sure that Selim will say more serious, less flippant things about Turco-British relations in my father's time and afterwards.
Well, thank you very much. But we have time, so please don't worry about speaking too much. It was absolutely fascinating. We look forward to hearing more later, but we have time. The place is ours. Nobody can throw us out.
Oh, okay.
So we can talk really much longer.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you all of you for having come today. It's the second time that the Anglo-Turkish Society is organizing an event to honor the memory of my father. I remember after he died in 1998, we had this meeting in the Mews, in a place that the society had just behind the embassy, and there were many speakers from among his friends who came to pay tribute, and I was privileged to speak at that event. So I'm extremely grateful to the society for having organized this, and for you all to have come in such big numbers, and for the introduction that Sir Kiran has given, and the memories that he has shared with us. Well, Sinan has spoken about the book. What I could say is that, and I think that nobody has mentioned that point particularly, is that they're unique. I do not remember, I'm not aware of any of my colleagues in the foreign ministry having done anything like that. I certainly haven't done it over a period of 40 years, recording, if not every conversation, but at least the ones that he considered to be worthwhile, by hand, immediately after they were held. It required a huge amount of discipline.
And in the language in which they were held.
In the language in which they were held. And that required a huge amount of discipline. I have never had that kind of discipline. So I never kept records of that nature. And I don't think that anyone else in the Turkish Foreign Ministry, or indeed, I don't know whether Sir Kiran can tell us whether someone in the British Foreign Service has done something similar in the past. So they're quite unique. So Sinan said that, you know, when he finished London, his tour of duty in London, he went off to Spain. During that time, I was a student at LSE, and this was the time, you know, when LSE was considered to be sort of a den of anarchists, if not worse, because there were demonstrations occasionally, not to foster world revolution. That was not the idea, but the objective was to stop traffic from using Houghton Street, which those of you who know LSE will know that it bisects the school in those days. Taxis and cars, you know, would use Houghton Street, and students, including your humble servant, would have to cross. And if you were engaged in conversation with a friend, well, you would be hit. And once or twice it has happened that the taxi, you know, ran over a student. So we organized boycotts and things. And during that time, when my father was ambassador, you know, there would be diplomatic dinners and at the embassy, and sometimes, you know, I would be added at the last minute. I had a black tie suit that had been made for that purpose, and so I would be added and at the table, which was a good experience, of course, for a guy of 19, 20 years old. But there were also occasions when somebody that I would want to see was invited, and so, you know, I would insist on being added. And one such occasion was Sir Alec Douglas-Home, was at that time Foreign Secretary, and of course these days I don't know whether Foreign Secretaries go to have dinner with ambassadors. As Sinan said, you know, the number, of course, has increased so much that it's probably not likely. But when Sir Alec was told that, you know, I was a student at LSE, this, as I said, was in the middle of the period where demonstrations and boycotts and things. So he took an enormous interest, because he hadn't, I don't suppose he had too many contacts, you know, with students from LSE. So I explained to him, you know, what the problem was and so on. I can't take credit for the fact that the traffic was banned from Houghton Street, because it took a number of years for that to happen, but at least, you know, I can't have done any harm. And so soon after I graduated from LSE, I joined the Turkish Foreign Service, and at that time, you know, there were very few people who could offer two languages, French and English, and I was one of the two in my batch who could do it. So my other colleague, who died young, unfortunately, came in first, and I came in second in that batch at the ripe age of 22. So at the age of 22, I was given the task of, in the Foreign Ministry, of managing the Montreux Convention. And this is, it sounds very grand, but of course it's a very routine job. You have to, so Kevin will remember, you notify the passage of warships from both coastal and non-coastal states. It's a very routine exercise, but it requires meticulous work because deadlines have to be kept and mistakes are unforgivable, because if you know the warship arrives at the Straits of the Dardanelles without the Turkish authorities having been informed, because the third secretary in the Foreign Ministry has forgotten to deal with the notification, then big scandal. I'm glad to say that it didn't happen during my time. So a few days after I started working, I was told that the third secretary of the British Embassy, Hayden Wallingash, wanted to come and see me. And so, I had been there for maybe a week, didn't know what to do and so on. And my bosses, were so busy doing other things that I couldn't go and ask, what am I going to do with this guy? And normally, they don't, I mean, these things are routine, as Sir Kieran will remember. You send a note through the registry and so on. But Hayden probably wanted to see the new guy. So he comes in, and I was so nervous, never having experienced this kind of thing. And he was barely older than me, but I forgot to tell him to sit down. I forgot to offer him a cup of tea, and he had this paper in his hand, and I was so, didn't know what to do or what to say. I treated it as if it was a declaration of war. So Hayden realized that the new boy was terribly sort of insecure. He didn't stay too long, delivered the note and left, but he didn't bear me a grudge, and invited me to the parties that he used to give for young diplomats. That was my first contact with British diplomacy. And that's why in this talk today, I plan to speak about interaction with British diplomacy during my 40-year career, rather than having a dry expose on Turkish UK relations. So, of course, in the first half of my 40 years in the foreign ministry, I dealt mostly with international organizations, spent a lot of time in Geneva and so on. But I did spend 2 years in Cyprus. Cyprus, of course, has been mentioned several times today already. And I was one of the most junior members of the staff at the embassy in Cyprus. And this is 1979, 80, something like that. And Lord Caradon, who, as Sir Hugh Foote, had been the last governor of Cyprus, he was very popular. He used to visit, both sides occasionally, and he was treated like a head of state. There were very few heads of state who visited northern Cyprus in those days, and even fewer, if that's possible, these days. He was treated as a head of state. There would be motorcycle escorts with blaring sirens and so on, and he would visit the ambassador, Turkish ambassador in the north. And as a junior member of the staff, I was expected to welcome him on the doorstep of the embassy, take him to the ambassador, and sometimes I'd be the note taker. And Lord Caradon tried his hand at Cyprus settlement, and with good intentions, and of course we all know that also failed. But I have to say that the British High Commission in Cyprus at that time was the one diplomatic mission with which we had the best relations, of course. And the big advantage that the British High Commission had in Cyprus is that it had two buildings, one on one side and the other on the other side of the Green Line. I suppose that's still the case. And so it enabled the High Commission to host parties and so on in the north, which the other embassies couldn't do. And plus, of course, there was a big...
I think it was the old High Commissioner's house.
Yes, that was the building in the north.
Yeah.
And it had a large garden, so very suitable for entertainment. And of course, there's this relatively big expatriate community, and that made the British High Commission very active in the north, unlike every other mission, including West. I do not remember any diplomats, from other countries, but I remember my British colleague Andrew Baird, who later left the Foreign Service and went into banking. So you probably haven't met him, I suppose.
What's his name?
Andrew Baird.
I know the name, but
yeah. And so they were very. I mean, the British, not just as a form of colonial power in Cyprus, but because of these advantages that it had, and of course Turkish speakers. And I'm going to come back to that a little later. There were as far as I know, no other countries that had Turkish speakers in Cyprus, but the British had. Andrew was a Turkish speaker, for instance. So, but why I really got to work more closely with the UK in my career is in the second half. And that's when I worked essentially on Turkey-EU relations. And I had come back from my first tour in Brussels, just as you were leaving, Sir Kieran. So I got to work with your successor, David Logan, quite well. And I remember, this is the time when the European Union was enlarging. Big Bang was started in 1997. Turkey, along with 12, I think, other countries, wanted to be a candidate. And the Luxembourg Summit of 1997, you probably remember that, December 1997, gave candidate status to 12 of these countries, but Turkey was given something bizarre called the European strategy. Turkey, nobody knew what it was. There was no finality to it, and there was no concrete content to it either. So it came as a big shock. But coincidentally, why did this happen? Well, because Helmut Kohl, who was the German Chancellor at the time and a Christian Democrat, considered that Turkey could not be admitted into the European Union. So other Christian Democrat leaders, and there were quite a few at that time in the European Union, followed him, and so this was decided. But in December 1997, then in January 1998 came the British presidency of the European Union, and there was an immediate turnaround. First, I was sent to London to say that after much hesitation, the Turkish government was going to accept this European strategy for Turkey. So we were going to play the game by the rules that were presented to us. And Robin Cook, who was the Foreign Secretary, came to Ankara to meet Ismail Cem, whose counterpart. There was a rather acrimonious meeting between them. But Robin Cook instructed the Commission to prepare a progress report on Turkey. And this was very surprising, from the EU perspective, because accession progress reports were only prepared for candidate countries. And I don't know how the British presidency managed to pull that one off, because the Germans, of course, by then the government had changed in Germany. Kohl had gone and was replaced, by the Greens and by the Social Democrats and the Greens. But it was certainly a very important step that the British played in that role at a very crucial moment. And so I've never sort of forgotten that. Then, of course, within a year or so, Turkey was given candidate status, and there was enormous enthusiasm for the European Union in Turkey at that time. You had all sorts of NGOs, professional associations, whatever, who wanted to invite an EU ambassador to speak about the European Union to their membership. And I was then Director General for the European Union. So they would call me and they would say, look, we want to invite an EU ambassador, but we don't have the means for simultaneous interpretation and all the technical equipment that you need for that and so on. So what should we do? And I would say, well, you invite the British ambassador, David Logan, because he's a Turkish speaker. And so one invitation, another one, this sort of went on. I remember one occasion when the German and the French ambassadors cornered me at some diplomatic event, and they said, how is it that it's always David who gets invited to these things? And I would say, well, not my fault if he's the only Turkish speaker amongst you. It was a great pleasure, to be able to tell them that, put them back in there. But it was true, and I think that language training, Sir Kieran, is extremely important. Not just Turkish, but some years later, I was ambassador in Korea, and in Korea there were just 2 ambassadors who spoke Korean. One was the Uzbek ambassador, who was ethnic Korean, and there was a big, during the Soviet times, there was a big community of North Koreans, who moved to Uzbekistan. So this ambassador was one of them. He spoke Korean, and he spoke nothing else. He was dean of the diplomatic corps. I was the only one who could communicate with him, because Uzbek and Turkish. But the only other ambassador who could speak Korean was Warwick Morris, who was the British ambassador. And this is really remarkable.
It's largely gone.
Well, this is what I was going to come to. If it is gone, it's a great pity. It's a great pity, and I do hope that people will realize the loss that this entails for British foreign policy, because it used to be an enormous advantage, for British diplomats to be able to speak a language like Turkish or Korean, and I'm sure other rather rare languages or relatively rare languages, gives them a tremendous leg up in their work. So that was certainly something that I hope that in time will be reconsidered. And then one last important British contribution to Turkish-EU relations, and thereby to relations between Britain and Turkey, of course, is the decision in December 2004 for accession negotiations to start with Turkey, when Jack Straw, who was the foreign secretary at the time, managed to pull off a deal with certain ambiguities, but we all know that if you want to get everybody to agree to something, there has to be a certain amount of ambiguity, but Jack Straw pulled it off. And that was the sort of the last major, I would say, contribution that the UK provided to Turkey EU relations, in those days, of course, the UK was among the most supportive countries of Turkey's accession quest. I've often wondered why, Sir Kieran, you may want to comment on what I'm just going to say, because I was thinking, how come that under different governments throughout a fairly long period, the United Kingdom was very supportive of Turkey. I've spoken of Robin Cook, I've spoken of Jack Straw, and so why? And the only explanation that I can give to myself is that, of course, the United Kingdom was never very keen on having a very centralized European Union, Federal Europe, as the French and the Germans call it or want it to be known. And if Turkey is a member, or was a member, it would have made a centralized European Union more difficult. I had the same feeling when I was ambassador in Sweden in the early 2000s, and Sweden also was at that time very supportive of Turkey's accession, and for the same reason, the Swedes were not all either very keen on a centralized Europe. So with Turkey in, they could guarantee that there would be no centralized system. Now, everybody knows the situation in which Turkey-EU relations are, and I think that if they ever normalize again, we will miss the presence of the United Kingdom among the members of the European Union. But now, of course, the UK has left the EU. In a certain sense, it makes the development of relations with Turkey a bit easier, because the UK is no longer bound by decisions which, in my experience, I spent something like 20 years on that file. In my experience, at the end of the day, the European Union takes decisions at the lowest common denominator. So everybody has to agree, and that means that the bar has to be set very low. So whoever shouts most gets his way, and that's why we're part of the reason why we're in such a bind at the moment. But if things begin to pick up one day, we will miss the UK. But meanwhile, you're freed from this shackle of the lowest common denominator, and I think that there is an opportunity. Mr. Erdogan is moving his foreign policy, at least towards the United States. In recent weeks and months, you can see that he's turning back towards Europe and towards the United States. Not so much towards Europe, because for Europe, Cyprus and human rights and so on are still very important obstacles, which don't seem to matter too much for the Americans. But if the process of rapprochement with the United States works, I think there might be a possibility for the UK also to come in. We already have a free trade agreement, and there's a negotiation which is planned to cover services and government procurement. So there might be something that could be done independently of what we do with the European Union. So yeah, I think I extended my welcome, so to speak, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, that was absolutely fascinating. I don't know whether Zeki would you like to make any comments?
I would, if I may.
Absolutely, go ahead.
On the question of British support for Turkish membership of the European Union, first of all, I think it was a huge mistake of Turkey not to apply in 1972 at the same time as Greece did. Probably neither would have got in, and I would have said that was actually good for the European Union because at the time Greece wasn't ready, and Greece after that for many years played a blocking role against Turkey. But my view, and I think it was the view of the Foreign Office, was that it was really important to anchor Turkey irrevocably in Western institutions and in a Western orientation. Because if you look right back to the Ottomans, and even maybe before the Ottomans, the drive was always westward. Rome was the golden apple. They reached the gates of Vienna twice. It wasn't, let's head back towards Samarkand. But I noticed when I was there, and I think it's got much stronger since, this kind of Eurasian tendency in thinking, particularly in the army. And you can understand it, you know, persistent rebuffs. I remember a foreign minister when I was there saying, how on earth can they put Bulgaria, the dairyman of the empire, ahead of Turkey? And it seemed that Turkey was being kept permanently in a kind of waiting room. Whoever joined ahead. Now that ended, but had not gone well because you now have Cyprus blocking things. And it may be natural, but still, I think the Western interest is in locking Turkey into that Western orientation. Mm-hmm. And it was very good when the Turkish government was for years trying to move towards meeting the Copenhagen principles, which are necessary in order to join the European Union, but if I may say so, they're also very good in themselves. I just want to make a point about an honest man sent to lie abroad for the good of his country, or for his country. Lie in Elizabethan times also meant live. Yeah. So it was a pun. It was an early pun. But I know that the guy concerned never got another embassy. So maybe it wasn't altogether appreciated. And also, you know, thinking back to your father's time and what life was like in your time in Cyprus. I was in Cyprus 69-72, and I used to give parties with Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, and that was always much easier before 1974. And I remember issuing a lot of invitations for a drinks party, and I got a call from the Under Secretary General to the Vice President, Dr. Kachuk, whom I knew reasonably well because I had a tailor who was just 2 doors up from Halkin Sessi, his newspaper, and in an afternoon or early evening, you'd find Dr. Kachuk sitting outside Halkin Sessi on a chair backwards and leaning over it and receiving, you know, good wishes or please or whatever. Anyway, he said, "You'll be very sorry, I believe you're giving a party next Tuesday night." And I said, "Yes." He said, "You'll be sorry to hear that no Turkish Cypriots will be coming." And I said, "Oh, that's terrible. Why is that?" He said, "Well, the Vice President, Dr. Kachuk, is insulted that you didn't invite him." And I said, "Look, I'm the Second Secretary. He's the Vice President of the Republic." And the Under Secretary said, "Well, if you want any Turkish Cypriot guests, I suggest you send him an invitation." So it was like, Cyprus in those days was quite like a large village. And the first Queen's birthday party, Makarios used to come to 2 national days. One was ours and the other one was the Greeks. And I was pretty new there and was keeping an eye on Denktash. And Denktash and Clerides were chatting, and Clerides said to Denktash, "You know what I miss most? I haven't had a kebab at Charlingham's for years, and Clerides said, well, let's go there now. And so to the horror of Clerides' bodyguards, off they went, because these things were held at the Palace, which is right on the Green Line. An hour and a half later, Denktash produced Clerides back again, but there was a lot of worry. So different times. Thank you.
There's a note in the book here saying it looks to us as if Denktash is going to be the most important man in Turkish Cyprus. It says so here.
Well, in those days, he was head of the Turkish Cypriot Chamber of Commerce. Communal Chamber.
Yes.
And Clerides was head of the Greek Cypriot Communal Chamber. And they could do some, you talked about being able to speak Turkish. I went to the Communal Chamber once because they were making a claim about that the percentage of Greek Cypriot, of Turkish Cypriots was 30%, not 18%. And they showed me a book with a site, and in it said something like Hakiki Resimler, and the other one was Yayın Lanan Resimler, and the Yayın Lanan were 30%, and the Hakiki were indeed 18. I said, oh, that's very interesting. What is this one and what is that one? He said, oh, that was the figures for 15 years ago, or whatever, but it wasn't. Anyway, never lie. Never lie. So my last word, never lie. When I was a very young diplomat, I read a book by Harold Nicholson called Diplomacy, and it said, others may, you mayn't. Every lie leaves behind a drop of poison. So I think as a diplomat, it's a really serious mistake, because if you're caught out, how can you ever be trusted again?
Of course.
And diplomacy is so much about personal relationships and confidence building. There was a period in the 70s or 80s when a lot of people said we don't need embassies, we've got fax machines. But I'm afraid that's not true. And these personal relationships do matter a lot, and they are based on trust. And if you lie, how can you be trusted?
We have a comment from the floor here, please.
Yeah, I'd like to say how wonderful it is to see Sinan and Selim here. I first met Sinan and Selim, I guess Sinan was about 8 years old, and Selim was about 6 years old.
Yes.
And I was on my gap year when I was hitchhiking through Turkey. I arrived in Ankara, having stayed with Savia, which was named after. And she said, well, you've got to go on, and I took a bus across the plateau and arrived at the bus station in Ankara quite early one morning. And my mother had told me, well, when you get to Ankara, I didn't speak any Turkish. She said, but what you've got to say, Harji Bakaleti, which in those days I think meant Turkish Foreign Ministry. Am I right about that?
Absolutely.
Apparently they've changed it now, but so I said that quite a few times, and eventually I got a dolmush, and then it was Sunday morning, so he'd obviously got the message, but there was Zeki. The first time I met him, and he was a very senior man, even in '59, because he was, I think, PUS, as it were. He was a senior diplomat. So it's wonderful to hear you reminisce about it. And for me, I felt very privileged, because even though my father was his half brother, in the sense that they shared the same father, he didn't actually know him very well. And only I think you could probably put down to the fingers of one hand the occasions when they met. Once was when Zeki and Neshla came to our little village in Winsford. I was in America, so I wasn't there for the wedding of my sister. So he meant an awful lot to me in a practical way. As a student, I also did what Sinan did. I catched from the Turkish ambassadors around the world. Some of them, I think, were a bit upset. They couldn't understand why this Brit. In fact, we were in Istanbul, not in Istanbul, we were in Kabul, where you had the most wonderful Turkish embassy. I think I stayed 2 weeks. a bit like Ripley. Anyway, just to move away from the family reminiscence thing, on the European front, which is really, really interesting, because if you take, as it were, the concentric model, what the UK at the moment is actually move out of even the concentric model, which is truly a pity. And I'm doing a little campaign now, at the very, very least, to get Britain, get the UK back into something called the European Environment Agency, which I happen to have written the rules for way back in the end of the 80s and the 90s when it was set up. And what did we write in Article 10? It said non-EU countries can be members of the European Environment Agency. And the wonderful thing is that Turkey is there, and Norway there, and Switzerland there, and Iceland there, and Liechtenstein there, and 5 Baltic countries are associated. And what I would very much like is to see the non-EU members, led by Turkey, say, come on, Britain, don't be so totally pathetic. You may, by accident, have left the EU, but this is the time to operate and say, rebuild the bridges, and this will be one good way. And so said, when you go back, I bet you've still got a lot of contacts in the Turkish diplomatic service. Put this on the table. And Britain, by the way, is about to hold, as I remember, the meeting of European Political Cooperation in the UK. I'm sure you're going to come to that, Turkey. So it'd be nice to see some mutterings about, come on, rebuild a few bridges, and this would be wonderful. Sorry to go on that. Wonderful to have, and to see my other cousin, who also, as it were, has this direct link bar, saying it by a mother.
Thank you.
You got a member of the Turkish embassy there. So he.
Oh,
Hello.
hello. Well, I met your ambassador the other day. Thanks.
Would you like to say a few words about this?
Well, I read one of Mr. Sinan Kuneralp's books before I moved here, the one about the First World War and propaganda, because I'm a military historian myself. And Selim Bey, he probably doesn't remember me, but when I entered the ministry almost 50 years ago, he was ambassador in Seoul, and then I followed in his footsteps, not as ambassador, but as second and first secretary, and it was my second posting. And now I'm here about to finish my posting in the UK. And I just wanted to say, heartfelt thanks on behalf of my ambassador who couldn't be here, because we have a delegation again every 2 weeks in the UK, which shows, the strength of our relations. Because either our guys come here and the following week, your guys go there. So I just wanted to say, convey my thanks, my personal thanks, and thanks from the embassy and the ambassador. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You don't think that you can encourage us to rejoin the European?
First, I think we should do that. So.
Any more comments, please, or thoughts? There's one thing I did want to mention, was it's so strong in this book, that the relations between Turkey and Pakistan, and I've noticed this before. Here in the book it's more straightforward, I think, because as far as I can see, Pakistan is wanting Turkish help with the quarrel with Kashmir in return for their help with the Arab countries for Turkey's negotiations in Cyprus.
Don't forget CENTO.
Yes.
CENTO existed then.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, if I remember rightly, Pakistan, Iraq, and
Iraq had left, of course, by then. Iraq left in 1959, 58.
in those days. And it was based in Turkey, in Ankara.
Early 60s, wasn't it?
But I think that in this particular case, it's the Pakistani High Commissioner, Mr. Hilali, who tried to arrange for a sort of unofficial contacts between the Turkish embassy in London and the Chinese People's Republic, whatever it was called, Chargé d'Affaires, and so that would lead to a recognition of China, continental China, by Turkey. So this, I think, has to be seen outside of the scope of Turkish-Pakistani relations. It was sort of an individual initiative on the part of Mr. Hilali. he would invite the charge d'affaires and my father, small dinner, small committees. It will be interesting to see one day when the Turkish diplomatic archives are open, how my father conveyed that message to Ankara, what it is, was encourage the recognition, or he stopped it, because he had some very close ties with what was called at that time Taiwan. He I don't suppose that he would back the recognition of continental China.
I'm sure everybody knows that there was a long history of Pakistan aligned with China and India aligned with Russia.
Exactly.
So during the Cold War, that was very much the lineup. So it explains why Pakistani might want to encourage Turkey to establish relations with China.
It surely happened in 1971, when the Baltic NATO countries, I think,
Followed Nixon, did he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting to know if, to see if other Pakistani diplomatic representatives in other capitals had approached their Turkish colleagues with the same view, or it was an initiative of the Hilali.
It would. But I can say a wonderful PhD thesis.
Exactly. But the problem is to find students.
Well, exactly. And your thoughts about the European Union in Turkey really are absolutely fascinating. I mean, was there any point at all when you suddenly said to yourself, maybe this time it's actually going to happen?
Oh yes, 1999, when the decision was taken to give candidate status to Turkey, and I was referring to that, the enthusiasm that was felt in Turkey, and that's why David was suddenly so popular. David Logan was suddenly so popular in Turkey, and you had EU flags, all over the country, and so on. And basically, people said, well, you've got the criteria. Even Sweden, for instance, before Turkey was given accession candidate status, Sweden had been rather cool about the perspective, or rather had wanted a sort of advance payment, so to speak. They wanted, Turkey to fulfill the criteria before receiving candidate status, and I remember talking about that with Swedish counterparts and telling them that the criteria only apply to candidates. You don't ask India to fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, I remember saying. So even Sweden understood the point, and so we were given candidate status. We were given a sort of a roadmap, the Copenhagen criteria that needed to be fulfilled, and there was, in the first years, enormous effort, even before the AKP came to power. And this was still under at the time of the coalition government, Ecevit and so on, who were rather disorganized and not terribly harmonious amongst themselves, a three-party coalition, each pulling in different directions and so on. But even they managed to do a certain number of things, and the European Union was also very welcoming at the beginning. What really started spoiling the thing was the accession of Cyprus, and that was a missed opportunity for Turkey, and because it should have been possible to settle the Cyprus problem before Cyprus acceded to the European Union. And unfortunately, 2002, 2003 were the times when we had this coalition government, and then right at the end of 2002, the AKP came to power, but it was too late for them to take control of things, and Cyprus, the Greek the Greek Cypriots signed the accession treaty on the 15th, I think, of April 2003. And after that, of course, it became very difficult to make progress because they would stop things at every stage. We managed to open one chapter and close it.
Since then, we've opened. That the British should have prevented the accession of Cyprus to the European Union, because the European Union listened to Britain on Cyprus.
I don't think that it would have been possible, for the United Kingdom to stop the accession of Cyprus, but simply because Greece was saying at that time that if Cyprus is not admitted, then enlargement will not take place, and this was, remember 2002, 2003, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and for the European Union, particularly Germany, the biggest priority was to make sure that these countries, Eastern Europe, never fell into the influence of Russia, and so that their accession had to be accelerated and so on. Many of them were brought in without being prepared. I mean, this is undeniable, and so Greece was saying, well, if you don't admit Cyprus, well, we're going to block the others, and so it wouldn't have been possible to prevent Cyprus from.
But the die was cast actually in 1995, when there was an agreement, part brokered by Dick Holbrooke. What's it got to do with the United States? But anyway, in which there was a deal in which Cyprus was offered the prospect of full membership without it being made a precondition that there should have been a settlement.
That was in Helsinki,
Sorry?
Helsinki, in 1999.
No, I'm talking about before then, because it was even when.
No, but what you just said was on paper in.
Yeah, but I know there was a deal done in 1995, and in return, Turkey was supposed to get all sorts of things from the European Union, which were then blocked by Greece. Britain could have stopped it by asking a very simple question, which is how, Greek Cypriots, do you intend to apply the acquis communautaire in the north of the island? Because without a settlement they couldn't.
And also the 1960 treaties, the Treaty of Alliances, that Cyprus shouldn't be a member of an international organisation unless the two mother countries are. So it was strange that Turkey waved that away, and then Cyprus was able to proceed without any hindrances. Because the 1960 treaties, one of them, the Treaty of Alliances, that Cyprus shouldn't be a member shouldn't join any organisation if Turkey and Greece are not also members. So if only one of them were, then that should mean that Cyprus can't be.
But what shocked me was I was in New York by the time, in the UN Secretariat, and we had a situation where the president of Cyprus campaigned actively for a no vote in the referendum on the deal that the settlement deal that we had negotiated, and we did a report to the Security Council spelling out in detail what had happened and suggesting that Turkey should not be punished in any way, but it should be acknowledged that the North had voted yes to the deal. And to my knowledge, it is the only formal report by the Secretary General of the UN to the Security Council that was never received in the Council. There was never a discussion, not even an informal discussion, and it wasn't. The Russians didn't want it, and the Germans didn't want it.
The French
didn't want it because the French and the Germans always saw the European Union as a Christian club. I wouldn't mind, only they both got really quite large non-Christian minorities, and indeed Christianity has faded in terms of observation, any meaningful observation in both those countries and in Britain for that matter. But it's still, I think, this feeling that it's a European club and the Turks are not Europeans.
But on this subject of the 1960 agreement, this is an argument that we have put forward time and time again throughout that period. The response from the European Commission was, well, you're right that there is, in I think the Treaty of Establishment, a provision which says that Cyprus cannot become a member of an organization of which Turkey and Greece are not both members. But the response that we got was, well, and there is a footnote to that provision, which says organizations as EFTA, the European Free Trade Agreement, and the Universal Postal Union.
And what?
Universal Postal Union. Organizations such as EFTA and Universal Postal Union. So when we raised this argument, and remember, Sir Kiran, Professor Mandelson wrote a book about this years ago. The response was from the Commission and the Member States, well, the European Union is not an organization like EFTA or the European or the Universal Postal Union, so we do not consider that this applies. Then the question was raised of whether we should take this to an international juridical body, ask for an opinion from the International Court of Justice, for instance. And but that line was never pursued. So the whole thing stayed in between, in limbo, and the argument could not be concluded.
Well, I can see that the former ambassador to London, Umid Bey, is with us. Umid Bey, good evening, how lovely to see you. Would you like to say something if the technology is working?
Hello, can you hear me?
Wonderful, wonderful. Good evening.
Hello, good evening. I am very happy to get this opportunity to say hello to many friends there. David, hello. Sir Karen, Sinan, Selim, Stanley, Johnson, Rachel, hello, friends. 1.5 years ago, I was that room for annual luncheon. I remember, very lovely event. And I would like to congratulate Anglo-Turkish Society for this lovely event for His Excellency Zeki Kuneralp and his notebooks of his London years, legendary Turkish diplomat. And I was so excited to be in his Zeki Bey's room twice. One in Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs as Undersecretary, and second time in London Embassy. And every time when I was looking at his photograph, I was so thrilled and excited to be in his shoes, in his room, because he was a legendary man. He served twice in London, and he was a fantastic person. And when I received his notebooks, thank you, Sinan Bey, I immediately read notebooks of those years of London Embassy. Then I saw many common things. Yes, there were different historical events, but I mean, the subjects are still same. I mean, from Palestine to Kashmir, Cyprus to NATO, and I thought that many things are still ongoing. And with this opportunity, I would like to say another thing, that there were 51 Turkish ambassadors' photographs or portraits on the Turkish embassy wall in the entrance. And whoever visited Turkish embassy, when they saw the photographs of those Turkish ambassadors, without exception, they asked only two guys. One, Muzurus Pasha, who served as Ottoman ambassador for 35 years in London, and the second, Zeki Bey, who has served twice in London. And because of that reason, for 4 years during my tenure, I explained Muzurus Pasha and Zeki Kuneralp to millions of visitors about their history and their impact on Turkish-United Kingdom relationship. Thank you very much for this opportunity to say hello to friends, and good evening, everybody.
Good evening. So we come back to this book then, which is Zeki Kuneralp going from door to door to door to door, saying to the British, please do something, this is a really serious matter. And the British give a whole variety of responses, and I recommend everybody to read this book if you really wish to see how traditional British diplomacy works, because it's not exactly the excuses, but the explanations that are given are very, very characteristic of our culture. But nevertheless, I can see the frustration behind the lines, saying, why can't we get the British to do something? And does anybody know why we felt so hamstrung, other than the fact that we felt that we didn't have enough money to do anything? in those early years? I don't know whether Zeki you remember.
Well, just before my time,
I'm sorry.
because I was a blank slate in those days, I think I can truthfully say. I think when there's a conflict between two parties, the British inclination is to say that the parties need to find they must have ownership. They need to find it. They may need some help. And it was interesting that Gullo Plaza gets named quite a lot in the thing. Well, I think he was pretty well, I may be wrong on this, but my impression is that he was the first and last mediator. Mediators can put forward proposals, and I think this was unacceptable to both sides, and we ended up with facilitators who can come up with ideas, but they're not allowed to make proposals. So again, the parties, of course, if you could produce a proposal they agree with 100%, wonderful. But produce something that they don't agree with, and no, we don't need that. So I think that's the reason why. And of course, we had interests. The bases come up a lot, sovereign-based areas in the journals, and that was a really major interest for Britain, and indeed still is to some extent. So during the negotiations on the Annan Plan in 2002-2003, we did indicate that we could make Decalia available because it would amount to about 1% of the island, but it never really got that far. And the real problem with that last big effort was that the things like the arrangements for compensating people who lost their homes were so incredibly complicated because we made proposals, we had to change them this way, change them that way. So when Kofi asked me to go to Cyprus every 2 weeks in the last stages of the process, and the first time I landed, a Greek Cypriot lady brought me a cup of coffee, and she said, "What are the arrangements for compensating me for my villa?" And I said, "Well, they're quite complicated." And I sent a cable back to him saying that I'm pretty sure by the time I got to Nicosia from Larnaca, I'm pretty sure that it's going to go down. The referendum's going to go down by 2-1 or even 3-1 because we couldn't explain clearly what this compensation was. Plus, Denktash had been extremely clever. He never wanted a settlement because he thought that the Turkish Cypriot community would become a minority and would be swallowed by the majority. So what he did, which was very clever, was liberalise movement across the Green Line. So Greek Cypriots could go very easily to the north. A lot of them, they went and had their dentistry done in the north. They had their tailoring done in the north. They had their cars repaired in the north. And there were casinos in Kyrenia, whereas casinos were not allowed in the south, so they could go and gamble in the north. So I said to Kofi, look, this is like, a couple who are living in sin and are being, and the mayor is being invited to get married, but his own relatives are telling him this is going to cost you an enormous amount, because that's what Papadopoulos was saying. It's going to be a huge burden on. So why do it? Because you're getting on perfectly well in this non-married relationship with all the benefits of a marriage and none of the costs.
Can I say something? I'm not sure if Leo or Joe have went to see Zeki in Istanbul, but Ivo and I went in 1993, where we invited ourselves to the flat in Fenerbahce, and I don't think that his mother was alive then.
No, she died in 1999.
She had died, but we had a wonderful dinner, and I'm sure that I didn't say anything nearly interesting enough for him to make one single note in the margin. But I just want to say that my Turkish cousins have been, from that point, so hospitable. I went to see Sinan when we were researching our common ancestor who was a slave. That's another story. And last year I was in Istanbul with you, Selim, for a conference on, I can't even remember what it was, but you very kindly came and took me out. I just have one question you may not want to answer in front of His Excellency, which is 75 years since the inception of NATO. How do you think NATO Turkey is playing its hand when it comes to the two wars, Ukraine firstly, and then, of course, Erdogan came out with some supportive comments when it came to what happened in Israel on October the 7th. So, sorry to cast a dark cloud over this, but I thought it's such a good opportunity.
My love, of course, well, thank you very much, Rachel, for this. I mean, this brings us to today's world, and of course I have to say, just to remind people that I'm retired. Whatever I say,
you can speak freely.
Not only can I speak freely, but whatever I say doesn't commit anyone else and myself. So that being said quite clearly, well, on NATO and Russia and Ukraine, you have to remember that geographically Turkey is in a very difficult location, and Russia is and has always been, and presumably will always be, a neighbor, and a difficult neighbor at that. Turkey cannot afford to antagonize Russia completely. But you also have to say, and I'm sure that Sir Kieran has views on that too with his experience, that there are very few areas where the interests of Russia and Turkey coincide. Whether it's the Caucasus, the Balkans, Cyprus, Syria, our interests conflict rather than coincide. And Turkey, is certainly not interested in seeing Russia demolish Ukraine and annex large parts of it. Mr. Erdogan repeatedly recalls that Turkey has never accepted the annexation of Crimea, for instance, where there's still a substantial Crimean Tatar Muslim community. But at the same time, we have a dependency on energy and so on. So there has to be a balance that has to be maintained in a way that countries that are farther away from the region do not really need to consider. And I don't think that this is going to change. I mean, Turkey would be delighted to see this war end, and certainly would be very unhappy if Russia got its way completely. So some sort of compromise is something that would be in Turkey's interest. On the Middle East, I think that, it's very, I mean, as Sir Kieran recalled from father's comments on Turkish foreign policy, the Islamic dimension, even in those days, in the 1990s, matters much more today. But the interesting thing is that whereas Mr. Erdogan has been very harsh in his comments towards Netanyahu and Israel and so on, in actual terms, in actual facts, nothing much has changed. Trade continues, and whereas Israel has closed its diplomatic missions in Turkey completely, the consulate in Istanbul, the embassy in Ankara, well, Turkey has withdrawn its ambassador from Israel, but the embassy remains open. There is a chargé who, in fact, the other day was summoned to the Israeli Foreign Ministry to receive a dressing down because of a comment that Mr. Brown had made about Netanyahu. So the diplomatic presence in Israel continues, trade continues. There's a lot of sort of flack and statements and so on, incendiary statements that are made, but at the end of the day, nothing much that has changed, and of course people have begun to notice this in Turkey, and one of the reasons why the municipal elections went badly for Mr. Erdogan's party is that the Islamist vote has gone to another party. People disappointed by the fact that in Israel the trade relations with Israel have not changed. Well, they've gone to another party. And you also have to remember that 60% of Israel's oil consumption comes from Azerbaijan, transits through Turkey, and that also continues unchanged. So there's a big distinction between what is said and what is done.
I think we've got time for one last point. If anybody please, go
Well, I
ahead.
could make, well, of course, bring the conversation back, if I may, to Zeki Bey himself. Because I remember at Oxford, I was a student with David Bartow, we were both together, starting reading Turkish. And in those days, of course, in the early 70s, students' interest in Turkey was sort of getting to Istanbul and getting high on whatever you could find to smoke. And we decided we ought to have an Anglo-Turkish society for the students, and with a pour présenter card from Geoffrey Lewis, we approached Zeki Bey, who very kindly agreed to be our patron. And he came along to an inaugural dinner at All Souls with his charming mother. And we had a delightful time. And I will never forget how he engaged with us, callow, 20-nothing-year-old students, and launched a number of us on, well, we suddenly realized that Turkey was a serious place. And we ought to sort of do something about it. And that got us all started, and I'll never forget that.
You'll be pleased to know that in the second volume, there is an entry about that dinner. And I would like to take this opportunity. The second volume will appear by the end of the summer. And those of you who want to receive it, please send me an email at the address that appears on the in the book, and I will very gladly send a copy.
Did your father have a model as a diplomat? Did he look back to Ottoman models or early Republican models or Harold Nicholson or other great theorists of diplomacy?
I think he admired a Turkish diplomat called Numan Menemencoğlu.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Who is father-in-law of Nermine?
Who is Nermine Menemencoğlu's uncle.
Uncle. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Who is it who worked in Ankara? Who ran the ministry?
He was the minister during a difficult time during the war, and then he ended up his career as ambassador in Paris.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we're almost out of time, but would our speakers like to say a final word? Should we begin with you?
Well, I don't think I've got anything to add really, except to say that on Ukraine, I think Turkey has done an admirable balancing job. I mean, they're selling Bayraktar drones. Turkey has a very great economic interest in the business of grain being exported from Ukraine, because a huge amount of it goes to factories in Istanbul. Russian and Ukrainian tourists matter a lot, so they're walking a fine line when they're walking it rather well.
Thank you.
Plus they're evading sanctions, of course, and Russia gets stuff via Turkey.
Yes. Yes.
I would like to point out to something that a proposal that sounds very bizarre and outlandish, but it reappears regularly in various entries, an exchange of population between the Turkish community and either the Greek-speaking community in Istanbul or another island somewhere in the Aegean. I don't know how seriously this was contemplated, but it appears regularly. It sounds Trace, yes, but it sounds completely outlandish, and
When I was in Cyprus, a lot of Greek Cypriots thought the Turkish Cypriots weren't really Turks at all, but they were what they called bambolinakos. They were cotton dressed as linen, or linen dressed as cotton.
Well, he does say in the book very clearly that the Turkish position is, if the Greeks carry on this way, the Turks will intervene militarily. He repeats that again and again and again. So that I'm sure the British cannot say, I don't think they ever did, that they were surprised when this happened.
And at one point, I think the British said, why haven't you intervened there?
Because they didn't have the landing craft. Very simple, literally, they couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And one of the
But
things
they had the support of, well, at least the moral support of the British government.
Well, would you like to say a final word?
Well, the final word is to thank everybody.
Yes,
for the time
that goes without saying.
And thank all the speakers, Sir Kiran, to start with, and you, David, for having organized this. And I'm extremely grateful, because this is the second time that this, as I was saying at the beginning, second time that the association has organized an event like this. And thank you all from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you very much.